Sinquefield Cup round number 7 recap. We have 4 very high level games for you today, and we're going to jump right into the first one. Mamedyarov with the white pieces against Nepomniachtchi with the black pieces. And we see this same setup. Whenever we see d4, we tend to see knight f6 and e6. This leads into either the Nimzo-Indian, or sometimes the Catalan, or sometimes the Queen's Gambit declined. Knight c3. This is almost always going to be met with bishop to b4. It's called the Nimzo-Indian. It's one of the strongest defenses for black to equalize when white does this combo d4, c4, knight c3, queen c2, castle, e4. And this is what white usually goes for in the Nimzo-Indian. White wants to build this huge center, and black needs to fight back with the pieces. So we see this pin on c3 and the pressure on the e4 pawn. d5, e5, knight e4, bishop d3. I tend to like these structures for white quite a bit because I see this pressure against the h7 pawn. I kind of like the potential for that kingside attack. And black has to figure out, can I use this quick development, getting the king castled so early, to fight for an advantage? c5, and there we see it. Black is trying to trade off central pawns, use that to play for an advantage. Use the fact that this king is still on e1, the knight's still on g1. Knight f3, takes, knight d7, defending the e-pawn, which was just attacked. Now we see aggressive play by Nepomniachtchi, queen to h4, but these guys are still in theory, hour and a half each, and we're still following 94 games at this point. On to g3. Looks weird, but we're still in theory. Castle, g5. So you might be looking at this game thinking, wow, these players are playing aggressive. Both players maybe want to play for the win. Jan Nepomniachtchi, he's already on a +1 score. Maybe he wants to catch up to Wesley So, who has the bye. That could be what's going on here. But what happens after c takes d, knight takes, or look at the stats right here. After c takes d, the draw percentage is 82% if bishop takes c3. And after knight takes, d takes e, takes bish, takes knight, takes pawn, we're still following one game. And this was Peter Lyko against Dominguez back from 2012, which was a draw. And if you look at the engine, it's saying that this all peters out into a draw, which is just kind of crazy. Takes, rook c8, pinning the c pawn, so there's no pawn takes bishop. Queen trade occurs, and now bishop takes pawn. If you look at the material count here, dead equal. This is forcing off a trade of the bishop because it's pinned down to the rook. And now we reach this opposite colored bishop endgame. 4 pawns each, 1 rook each, and the players just are blitzing this game out. 1 hour and 27, 1 hour and 18. They very quickly head to a draw. This was not a very exciting game, but it was a high-level game. They both played very accurately. Neither player made any mistakes. 99 to 98.9. That's insane. So just a high-level game by both players. It'll get a little more exciting as we go. This one also very high level. Look at that, 98.8 to 98.2. Let's walk through it. We get a Roy Lopez with knight f6. So this is kind of like a Berlin declined when you see an early d3 defending this pawn. We're still following a lot of games up until d5. So this is the first move that's a little bit rare. And if you look at the eval, it's close to equal, so it's not probably a terrible move. Stockfish is okay with it. And I think the idea is black gains more space, but the pieces are a little bit awkward for black. Like this pawn on e5 is sitting on the half-open file. Maybe white could use that to their advantage. Pawn to b4, the bishop retreats. Pawn to a4. Watch out for the trap of the bishop. I was curious here, could a5 be played right away? But there's bishop takes f2, king takes f2, pawn to e4. And if d takes e, knight takes e4, and black has the advantage here. Even though white's up 2 points in material, players both obviously knew this line. But to me, first glance, I was like, oh, it looks like this bishop is just getting trapped, pawn to a5. Knight d2, bishop f5, and there still must be no a5 because he goes bishop to a3. Yeah, a5, bishop takes f2 is still the response. And this opens up a new threat, pawn to b5, attacking the queen and attacking the knight at the same time. Pawn to e4 played though. It's a counterattack, and it's also looking to open up this e-file against the white king. D takes e, knight takes, bishop takes, the queen's trade off, white gets castled. So now we reach an endgame, equal material, 2 bishops and a knight each. This is probably the weakest pawn on the board, but this pawn's also weak because it's sitting on the half-open c-file, and maybe black can get a kingside or an attack going, I should say, against the white king. Rook to c8, good looking move. Bishop to d5, takes. We're sitting at about a 0.3 eval. Again, very solid game from these two, similar to what we saw in game number 1. Knight to e5, a trade occurs, king c2, and now we're looking at very equal territory. Same colored bishops, no pawns locked up though, so neither bishop is really better than the other one, even though this bishop is outside the pawns and this one's trapped currently. This guy's a little bit short on moves because a5 could be played at any time, and this bishop will come back into the game pretty quickly because, like we mentioned, none of these pawns are locked up. Bishop takes f2. Here, rook takes e5 looks tempting, but there's this tactic, bishop to d4, forking rook and pawn. This would be really bad for white. When the rook moves, rook takes c3 check, and then this bishop is also attacked. It's all falling apart. So white plays b5 here. Hits the rook moves, and now rook to d1. So even though Levon is up a pawn, these are very strong super grandmasters. They have it figured out. They know when they can give up a pawn for dynamic play. In this case, Fabiano gives up a pawn, but he knows he has the activity to make up for it. Bishop back to b6. You could trade rooks off here, but then you're going to be down a pawn in a bishop and pawn endgame only. That's going to be dangerous for Fabiano. Same color bishops, up one pawn, that can give good winning chances. But with rooks on the board, if Fabi can keep a more active rook, then he's got counterplay for the pawn. So bishop to b5. This is looking at an a5 idea, I think. So a5 played by Aronian. Takes. And look at the clocks. Fabiano is just insane this tournament. Hour and 34 minutes left. He has gained over 4 minutes. And we're 23 moves deep. Levon is down 8 minutes from the start with a 30-second a move increment. So he's used quite a bit more time than Fabiano, but he's still essentially blitzing out these moves too. And the eval is 0.00. Now Fabi gets the pawn back. Take. Equal pawn endgame. There's another temporary pawn sacrifice by Fabi, but this pawn is attacked. And interesting, Fabiano keeps going for this dynamic play, and I think he's got this exciting style now where he's playing for a win more often. He's trying to create some issues for his opponent, and I like watching it. Fabiano is so well booked up. Sometimes he's thought of as more of a dry player, but I think in the past year or so, he's been playing really aggressive. It's hurt his rating a little bit, but I think he's trying to find this new playing style. And I like to see it. So now we have 2 passed pawns for Fabi. Levon does not have any passed pawns yet. 1 drops, but this A pawn is super dangerous. Okay, rook to G1. Rook takes pawn, rook takes pawn. So black has a passed pawn on H. White has a passed pawn on A, and black has an additional passed pawn. You might be thinking this is better for black, but this pawn has a 2-move head start. Black needs H3 and that bishop to move just to catch up to white's pawn. Bishop to G1. And you do have to be a little bit careful here. They were looking at a lot of the lines in post-game analysis. Sometimes black can get into trouble and potentially not able to get back and stop this pawn. So Levon smartly puts the bishop here, defending this square. A7 played, and he just immediately sacrifices it. So now we have 2 pawns against the bishop. And rook and bishop against rook is a theoretical draw. It's not always the easiest to draw, but these guys know that. So at this point, they both probably know it's headed towards a draw. Fabiano can pretty easily stop these pawns with bishop and rook. And look at this cute finish. Rook takes G7, forcing that trade. Now we have bishop against rook, which is a really easy draw for white. Because king and rook, it all comes down to the timing. You need the side with the lone king to kind of walk into the checkmate. You have to force him into that. With the extra bishop, there's way too many moves for Fabiano. And look at how they agree to the draw. king h8, pin the rook, and then take the rook. That's pretty funny. All right, so 2 draws, 2 very high-level games. Let's go into the next one. MVL against the talk of the tournament, Hans Niemann. MVL starts with knight to f3. I have not seen much knight f3 from MVL, and Hans said he was completely surprised by this. I don't know if this is some kind of gamesmanship because of the stuff that's been going on with Hans Niemann. Maybe he just wants to avoid any sort of preparation by Hans, take the game into a different territory. And Hans spends quite a bit of time on this second move. So he's down to 1 hour and 19 minutes on the first 2 moves. The reason why he did this is he was trying to figure out, why did Maxime play knight f3 and g3? Is there some sort of position that he's trying to trick Hans into that's more difficult to play? That's kind of what's going on here. Hans had to spend the time trying to figure out, how do I avoid being tricked? So he played bishop to g2 and pawn to c5. He goes for this big pawn center setup. I think that's kind of the most standard way to play against knight f3, g3. And now he's probably going to go for this Grunfeld-esque move, pawn to g6. Castle, g6, d4. Looks just like a Grunfeld, both sides doing kingside fianchetto. Everything is going to turn out symmetric. And this should give just a very small pull for white. Because when you have this complete symmetry, like we have here, but it's white to move, that tends to be a small advantage. Engine says about 0.4, maybe 0.5. Knight to b3 played. This is not the top engine move. Looking at the opening book, it's the 3rd most popular. But black doesn't win very many games, only 18%. So that might have been kind of what MVL wanted, just a low-risk move. Knight to c3 is the main line. And Hans talked about this a little bit after the game. Knight takes c3, b takes, knight to c6. Even though white wins quite a bit more often than black, it's only 13% for white. And 82% of the time, this has been a draw out of 56 games. So knight to b3 played. Knight to b4, that's a strong move, kind of eyeing this c2 square, because if the queens trade, knight to c2 could win the rook. Knight to c3, knight c6, bishop to d2. This is kind of a tricky move. It's hard to tell where to put this bishop exactly. It could go to f4, it could go to g5. Bishop to d2 though, this just avoids the queen trade, keeps some pieces on the board, and the rook wants to come to c1 next, kick that bishop out, and then maybe move this guy again. So aggressive play by Hans, bishop to f5. Again, eyeing this c2 square. Rook c1 and a3, kicking the knight out. Now at this point, the knight on a6 is a pretty bad piece. It can't go to c5, it can't go to b4. But this b3 knight is also a bad piece. It's not defended by a pawn anymore. It can't go to a5, c5, or d4. So this is sort of a battle of the bad knights. If you look at the other pieces in this position, these 2 knights are identical, these 2 bishops are identical. This bishop probably favors Hans slightly over this bishop. And you might be able to claim that this knight on b3 is slightly better than the knight on a6. So essentially the position is equal if you factor in all of the different imbalances between the pieces. Bishop to e3 played. And now we see a couple inaccurate moves coming up by Hans. He goes bishop to e6. He said he saw a game in this line. I don't know if this could be the game, but this one was a win for white. He said he saw a game in a line like this where it ended up being a draw by repetition with this idea like bishop e6 going back to f5. But after queen c2, bishop f5, MVL says, no thanks, I'm playing bishop to e4, not taking that repetition. And white's a little bit better here. So now Hans has to think, do I want to go for this bishop trade? The bishop on the long diagonal tends to be the better bishop. So I think Hans is okay with the bishop trade. He could even take right away. But the reason MVL is going for this is because if bishop takes, queen takes, look at how nicely that queen is posted up on e4. And oftentimes in these kind of positions with so many pieces on the board and open files, C and D, it comes down to who can find a safer square for the queen. If your queen is uncomfortable and can't find a safe home, that's where you can start to run into some trouble. So here, that's what I think both players are thinking about, is where do we put the queen safely? Queen d7, rook to d1, queen e6, and now this is a small slip up. Bishop takes e4 is still better, so 2 moves in a row, bishop takes e4 was best for Hans. He gets this uncomfortable position after bishop takes f5, because now he has to double his pawns. I don't know why he wanted the doubled pawns. He must have just felt that this was a safer way to get to the draw. Like, let's get the queens off in this manner, not allow that white queen up on e4. But after g takes f, there's a really nice move here that MVL missed. And I didn't hear MVL talk about this after the game, but they asked Hans about it. Hans did not seem to have it calculated. He was playing on intuition here. He did not think that this move was good enough, but knight to d5 is really hard to deal with. Knight to d5, if you look at the different replies, you might be thinking like knight to d4 could be played or knight to e5 because there's going to be a double attack on the queen. So let's look at knight to d4. There's now queen takes c8. If rook takes c8, rook takes c8 check, bishop to f8, knight takes e7 check. White is winning this. Let's see, what else could black try? You could go knight to e5. If knight to e5, there's also queen takes c8, rook takes c8, rook takes c8 check. And the problem again is there's no queen takes because of the knight fork. And after bishop here, there's rook to d8, and white again has a big advantage. So what else could black try here? Knight's posted up on d5. Rook f to d8. That's the top engine move. Now there's knight to f4, kicking the queen again. And this is just a little bit uncomfortable. I'm trying to figure out what to do with the queen. So interesting move, knight to d5. That was MVL's chance to play for the advantage here. That's around a +1 eval, which is a pretty large advantage. Instead, he plays knight to d4, takes, and knight to c5, takes. Here you could claim a very small advantage for white because this pawn is weak, and white doesn't have any weak pawns in this position. Rook to d5, double attack, knight e4, queen d3, getting away from the pin. Triples on the d file. So MVL does have a controlling position here. Knight takes c3, pawn takes, and rook c8. And the problem in this position for MVL is now he has a weak pawn. The king can't really be targeted here on g7. So after this trade of pawns, this is very close to equal. Queen trade. And at this point, both players know this is going to head to a draw. So I'll play through these pretty quickly. There was no way for MVL to create an advantage, and this is kind of a cool thing to talk about. Rook f6, that's a high-level move by Hans. After this trade, these pawns look super ugly. But actually, the idea is, if it's just one rook each, and only the kingside pawns, so pretend the queenside pawns are gone, these pawns are stronger for black than if that pawn was on g6. And the reason for that is, the pawns on f are ready to trade off this potential passer, the e pawn. So these pawns give black better coverage than if that pawn was on g6. So high-level decision by Hans, allowing that trade, knowing that these 3 pawns do a good job holding these 4 pawns. Okay, but Hans does still keep the a pawn for now. And this is just one of those positions you have to know. If pawn to a2, the white king needs to make sure that there's never a check, because then the pawn queens. But obviously MVL is not going to fall for that. A little bit of repetition here. Hans is just saying, I'm not going to do anything. I want to keep this spare move for my rook. I don't want to trap my own rook in, knowing that you're not going to allow a check. That's good endgame technique. Now he finally does play a2 because rook takes f6 was threatened. And now he can wait with the king back and forth. And there's just nothing that Hans can do here. He can't let the rook leave the a file. The king is completely stuck. Nothing MVL can do here, I meant to say. King is stuck, can't move the rook off the a file, and he doesn't want to push any of these pawns. So draw agreed. So 3 draws so far. If we look at the accuracy scores, both over 98 for that game. All right, 4th and final game. This was a long one. Dominguez Perez with white, Alireza Firouzja with black. And we see a Sicilian Najdorf variation. And we've seen this before. Sicilian Najdorf tends to be an aggressive system, very dynamic. And this is kind of a cool move. If you haven't seen it before, bishop to c1. The idea here is the knight pretty much has nothing better to do than to go right back to f6. So you could repeat bishop to e3. And they do repeat. And then finally, Dominguez Perez says, okay, I'm not going to go for that early repetition. And he changes up the move, bishop g5. That's kind of an interesting thing to figure out. Who's going to be the first one to go away from the repetition? g5. And I think this was a little bit of prep by Dominguez Perez because both players are still over 90 minutes, and he's kind of encouraging Alireza to take this aggressive setup. When you push those pawns h and g like that, that tends to open up your king side, so it can be pretty double-edged. Bishop g7, h3, knight e5, knight f5. This is going for the bishop pair because it's very uncomfortable to have this knight attack the bishop. Black is going to take. Every single game black takes. But now white has two bishops to black's one. And the upside for black is this weak pawn, and that bishop is pretty strong. The knight's pretty strong. Knight to d5. And this is where things start to get a little bit crazy. e6, f takes e, f takes e. Look at the black king. It's extremely exposed. There's no pawns on this 7th rank except the b pawn. That means that white can pretty easily attack. Like queen to h5 check is already really tempting. And he starts with knight to e3. This is still book. Queen a5 check, c3. And now knight to f3 check by Alireza. And you can look at and see that this bishop and queen are both attacking c3. We are still in theory though. G takes f. Bishop takes c3. Queen takes c3 check. Material count here is +4 for white, but the queen is also on the rook. We're following 5 games. Let's see who's played these games. Anish Giri versus Maxime. Wesley So against Maxime. And a few other games. But Maxime has played this twice from the black side. That's kind of interesting to see. And those games were in 2019 and 2020. So Alireza here is doing his best Maxime Vachier-Lagrave impression. Queen d2, take, knight d1. So Firouzja is +1. And look at this, hour and 37 minutes. These guys are so crazy. We're 22 moves deep, and this is all in their theory. This generation of chess players, I think, are levels above in terms of opening theory over past generations. And that's not even counting the fact that they have computers at their disposal. They're just absorbing so much more information. If you take like what was relevant knowledge back then, what's relevant knowledge now, I think they have more breadth. They can play more different systems, and they know all the critical lines in those systems. It's really hard to outplay each other at the super GM level. Queen d4, offer the queen trade. And Alireza is +1. So here we have a rook for 2 bishops, and there's 2 pawns for it. So rook and 2 pawns for the bishop pair. Knight e5, take, take. That's a big decision, giving up the bishop pair, but that knight is so strong that there's really nothing better. Bishop to e2 is not as good as taking on e5. Queen takes, king f1, castle. So at this point, the dust is finally starting to settle just a little bit, but the king is still in danger on f1, and the engine's saying small advantage for white, right around 0.6, so half a pawn or so. Bishop e2, that's the strongest move. Rook c8. This, to me, looks easier to play for black. I like how both rooks are already well placed, queen's well placed, but the downside is there's bishop and knight for white. And if the bishop and knight get moving, they're going to be much stronger than a rook. Bishop and knight, 2 pieces, are almost always stronger than 1 rook once they're able to get active. Rook f4. And this is kind of a cool move. h4. This is trying to expose the black king. Rook to g1 could be coming soon if these pawns trade off. So rook f4 by Alireza, trying to keep his king protected. Lanier tries to sneak the queen in. Rook takes h4, and he gets it. Queen g6 check. Take, take. Takes h6, and takes h4. Now the material's back to equal. We have bishop and knight for rook and pawn. Small advantage for Lanier again. If you look at the clocks, 41 minutes to 34. We're on move 32. King goes over, check, 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 check. Repetition offer. Firouzja, just move your king back to d7. We can have a draw here. Nope, he plays queen c5. He says, I'm not going to take the draw. I want to play for the win. And that's his fighting style. Firouzja is kind of known for this. He doesn't play a lot of the quick draws, even though at this point it would be reasonable. We're in the endgame, 37 moves deep. Now Firouzja starts trying to get the pawns rolling in the center. Look at that center. d5 and e5. But practically speaking, this is kind of a good thing for Lanier because those pawns are weaker now. As the pawns come down the board, they become bigger targets. Like you see the knight on e3 is attacking d5, queen's attacking e5, right? So these pawns are targets now. And if you look at the clocks, we have 9.5 minutes to 4:50. So these players are under some pressure. Okay, queen b3, double attack, rook d8 to defend, bishop to c2, queen d3, sitting right around a half pawn advantage still for white. Bishop here, triple attack. I think here knight to g4 is the stronger move. I'm looking at Stockfish attacking this pawn. The reason he did this, I do understand he wants to separate these pawns. So oftentimes two pawns next to each other like that, they're a lot stronger than if one pushes forward. Because currently the pawns attack light and dark squares. Once one pushes forward, they have no light square coverage. So that was kind of the idea. Make a pawn push forward and then we could blockade them. Like maybe this knight or queen ends up on e4, and then we can start to go after the king and target this backward pawn. Queen trade offer, very interesting. If queen takes, this endgame is good for white, and it might be close to winning. Engine's only saying 0.7, but I think practical chances white's never going to lose this. So instead, Alireza plays d3 check. That's the strongest move. King d2, and now drops the queen back. This pawn is dangerous because it's a pass pawn and the rook is parked behind it. Knight to e3. Rook to d4, attacking the queen. King b8. Queen a5. Queen to f6, attacking this pawn on f3. And now we see Dominguez start to get these pieces active. This knight-queen combo can be dangerous. Watch for queen to d8 check ideas. Queen d6. There's also queen to c7 check. So queen to d6, shoring up that check. Knight goes back, queen goes back, knight goes back. And finally, we have a draw agreed. Neither side could make progress here. This is a draw with best play. So all draws today. Taking a look at the standings, this page was updated after round 6, even with the refresh. So Wesley So is still going to be in the lead. He has +2 currently, so 4 out of 6. And now we also have 2 players on +1. That's the players that have 3 out of 5 on this current tab. Alireza Firouzja and Jan Nepomniachtchi now both have 3.5 out of 6. So look for those players trying to catch Wesley So. 7 rounds completed, 2 more rounds to go. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in tomorrow's recap.